Hey guys, this morning we stand at the edge of something beautiful. The fresh, glowing hush of dawn that feels like God Himself is painting light across the sky. You hear the quiet stir of the world waking, the birds daring to sing before the city hums, and in that moment you wonder, what new thing might God have planned for you today? Maybe it's something small, like the smile of a stranger. Or maybe it's something so big you won't survive the day without His presence guiding you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to hear in the comments, what does your morning look like right now? Now, take a deep breath, feel the morning light on your face, and let's begin today's prayer together. You stand as countless generations have stood, morning worshipers since the early church, who rose before dawn to read the Psalms. Some scholars debate whether they sang quietly to avoid persecution or lifted voices boldly to proclaim their faith. And did you know? Ancient farmers believed dew was heaven's kiss upon the earth each morning. Even now, as the air is cool and the light is new, you are held by God's mercy. You breathe in slowly, and the very first breath you claim today is not just air. It is God's reminder that He chose to wake you up. Before you scroll, before your phone lights with news, before the world asks you for 100 things, you pause. You let this breath become your offering, as if you're telling heaven, Lord, this day is yours. The early Christians practiced this too, whispering morning prayers before stepping into marketplaces or homes. Historians still argue whether those first gatherings happened on rooftops or in secret courtyards, but every record agrees they began with prayer, not with plans. And here's a curious tidbit. In medieval monasteries, the first sound of the day wasn't roosters. It was the bells at dawn, calling monks to prayer. Imagine being woken not by an alarm, but by sacred chimes reminding you that your soul has a rhythm. You may not live in a cloister, yet God hears you the same way, whether your alarm is birdsong, traffic, or a buzzing phone. So, with that first deep inhale, picture God's presence filling your chest. As the morning light warms your skin, feel His peace settle over your spirit. This moment of stillness becomes your shield for the day. You let your heart travel back in time, remembering that prayer in the morning is not a new invention. It is a rhythm as old as faith itself. The Psalms speak of voices lifted at dawn, and ancient believers believed morning was when heaven's gates opened widest. Early Christians clung to Psalm 5:3, whispering, "My voice shalt thou hear in the morning, O Lord." Historians still argue whether this was recited as personal devotion or as part of communal liturgy. But either way, dawn became sacred ground. Think of it. In small stone chapels, candlelight flickered as worshippers gathered before sunrise, their voices mingling in prayer before stepping into fields or markets. And here's a quirky fact. Some monks drank a bitter brew of herbs at sunrise, believing it sharpened their prayers. Strange as it sounds, it reminds you that people through the ages sought anything to stay awake for God. You too join that lineage today. As the first rays streak across your window, your prayer becomes part of a river of voices flowing through history. You may not wear robes or light candles, but your whispered, Lord, guide me, is just as weighty in heaven. Strength begins here, at dawn, with God's listening ear. You notice the silence around you, and in that stillness, something sacred stirs. The world outside may already be rushing, engines starting, voices rising, but here, in the pause of morning, God leans close. Silence is not emptiness. It is space where his whisper is easier to hear. The desert fathers of the 3rd century discovered this when they retreated into the wilderness, seeking God in quiet dawns. Historians still argue whether they fled society out of fear or out of love for simplicity. But the fruit of their silence became a legacy of deep prayer. And did you know that in some old villages, people would cover mirrors at night, believing dawn's first light carried mystery and should be welcomed without distraction? Quirky, yes, but it tells us something. Humanity has always felt mornings were sacred thresholds. So as you stand in your room, with sunlight gently spilling through curtains, you let silence speak. You don't need clever words or perfect sentences. Your breath, your heartbeat, even your pause becomes worship. In that quiet, God clears away yesterday's noise, resets your anxious thoughts, and gives you direction for today. This silence is not empty. It is full of Him. You picture those who came before you, rising before the sun, knowing that the first moments of the day belong to God. Saints, reformers, and ordinary believers all carried this same rhythm. Martin Luther, for example, was said to spend hours in morning prayer, declaring that if he had a busy day ahead, he prayed longer, not shorter. Historians still argue whether this was discipline or desperation, but either way, his mornings began anchored in God. And here's a curious note. Some early believers marked sunrise with the crow of a rooster, believing it was heaven's reminder of Peter's denial and of God's forgiveness renewed with each dawn. A strange connection, yet it made every morning a call back to grace. So as you stand here today, you remember that you are part of a great chain of dawn seekers. You don't need stained glass or incense to join them. Your prayer, whispered in the quiet, becomes just as precious. God sees you rising to meet Him, just as He saw monks in stone chapels, mothers in kitchens, farmers in fields. The same sun that warmed them now shines on you, and the same God bends to listen to your first words. You smile at how wonderfully human mornings can be. For monks in medieval Europe, the day began with the ringing of bells, summoning them to prayer before the world stirred. For you, it might be the beep of an alarm or the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. Historians still argue whether those bells were more about spiritual discipline or simply about keeping communities organized, but either way, they shaped lives around God. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some 18th century believers insisted on drinking water mixed with honey before prayer, convinced it made their voices sweeter to God. Odd as it sounds, it shows how people carry their own little rituals into sacred moments. Maybe you have one too, like wrapping yourself in a blanket before prayer, or holding your coffee mug as if it were a chalice of morning grace. God isn't waiting for perfection. He meets you in the quirks. He listens through yawns, sleepy eyes, even half-formed sentences. Every routine can become holy ground when you invite Him into it. So, as you tie your shoes, sip your drink, or stretch your arms to the sky, remember, God is already present. The ordinary is where His extraordinary peace begins. You let your eyes catch the sunlight as it filters into the room, and you remember the promise written in Lamentations: His mercies are new every morning. That truth has echoed across centuries, giving comfort to souls waking with burdens. Historians still argue whether Jeremiah spoke these words during Jerusalem's darkest destruction or afterward in rebuilding, but the essence is the same. Every dawn carries God's fresh mercy. And here's a curious fact. In some ancient cultures, people believed the morning sun itself carried healing, urging the sick to sit in its rays for strength. They might not have understood biology, but they sensed what you feel now. The morning light revives more than just the body. So as the new day unfolds before you, imagine mercy falling like fresh dew upon your spirit. Yesterday's failures no longer cling. Yesterday's tears no longer define. You wake into a day God has already washed clean with grace. Your mistakes are not your morning's anchor. His love is. You step forward, lighter, freer, steadier, because His mercies did not run out last night. They are waiting at your window, bright as the sun, tender as the breeze, calling you to begin again. You glance at your calendar, at the list of tasks waiting, and already you sense the pull of urgency. Yet mornings with God remind you that when plans shift suddenly, His hand still guides the day. The early church fathers often wrote about divine interruptions, those unexpected turns that revealed God's presence in disguise. Historians still argue whether Paul's detours across the Mediterranean were strategic or spirit-led, but the results shaped the world. And here's a quirky bit. In some rural towns, people once said, if your cart wheel broke in the morning, it was God's way of steering you from unseen danger. It may sound superstitious, but it speaks to the same truth. You never know how delays become protection. So when your day doesn't unfold exactly as planned, you can breathe instead of panic. A traffic jam may open space for prayer. A canceled meeting may free your heart to call someone who needs you. Even the smallest disruptions can carry divine fingerprints. As morning prayer fills your soul, you carry peace into every shift, knowing nothing is wasted. God shapes not just your planned steps, but even your stumbles, weaving them into unexpected blessings. You close your eyes for a moment, and in the quiet, you picture your prayer not as words slipping into the air, but as fragrance rising toward heaven. Scripture often compares prayer to incense sweet, steady, lingering in the presence of God. Historians still argue whether the incense burned in the Temple of Jerusalem was meant more for symbolic devotion or for practical cleansing of the air, but its meaning has always endured. Prayer drifts upward and pleases the Lord. And here's a quirky fact. In some old households, people would hang herbs above the doorway at dawn, believing the scent would chase away evil spirits. While science may dismiss it, the image remains fragrance, marking a space as safe and blessed. So as you whisper your morning thoughts, your gratitude, your worries, your hopes, imagine them like a fragrance filling the room. Each word, no matter how halting, carries sweetness to the throne of heaven. And even when you can't find words, your sighs and silences rise like incense too. God breathes them in with delight. Your morning space, whether it's a kitchen corner or a quiet car ride, becomes a holy sanctuary, fragrant with prayer and filled with His nearness. You think of courage and how often it is born in the soft light of morning prayer. The pages of history tell of believers who faced impossible challenges yet began their days on their knees. One story tells of Susanna Wesley, mother of John and Charles Wesley, who found her courage by covering her head with an apron in the morning, praying even as children ran around her. Historians still argue whether this was desperation or devotion, but her prayers shaped generations. And here's a curious fact. In ancient Japan, warriors would bow to the sunrise before battle, believing the light gave them strength. Different faith, different culture, yet it reveals a shared human longing to face the day with courage drawn from beyond oneself. So as you greet this morning, your whispered prayer becomes your shield. Courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it begins with the smallest words, Lord, be with me today. You may not fight wars or lead revolutions, but you will face meetings, decisions, conversations, and temptations. And in all of them, courage drawn at dawn equips you. Just as sunlight chases away night, prayer sends fear fleeing, reminding you that God walks ahead into every battle you'll meet today. You look around at the ordinary things, the steaming mug, the stack of dishes, the half-open blinds, and realize joy often hides in places you overlook. Morning prayer doesn't erase chores or errands, but it transforms them. Early church communities believed every act, from baking bread to sweeping floors, could become worship if offered to God. Historians still argue whether this idea emerged more from Jewish temple traditions or from the teachings of Paul. Yet its influence has shaped Christian practice for centuries. And here's a quirky note. In the Middle Ages, some households believed the first loaf of bread, baked at dawn, carried a blessing for the whole family. People even tucked crumbs into their pockets as a charm of good fortune. Strange as it sounds, it shows how the ordinary morning meal carried extraordinary meaning. So as you sip your coffee or tie your shoes, you invite God into these simple rituals. The ordinary turns luminous. The sink becomes an altar. The commute, a pilgrimage. The kitchen, a sanctuary. You begin to notice that holiness is not locked away in stained glass windows, but hidden in your daily steps. And joy rises quietly, tucked inside the common rhythms of life. You can already feel how the day might press in. Deadlines stacking, voices demanding, unexpected stress waiting just around the corner. Yet, in this morning space, God wraps peace around you like a cloak. The Apostle Paul wrote from prison, "Do not be anxious about anything." And still, historians argue whether those words were practical counsel or supernatural confidence. Either way, they remind you that peace is not the absence of problems, but the presence of God. And here's a quirky bit. In medieval times, some believed carrying a sprig of lavender in the morning warded off panic and fear throughout the day. While modern science credits lavender with calming effects, the image remains powerful. People always sought tangible reminders of peace. So as you breathe deep now, imagine God's Spirit like fragrance filling your chest, slowing your pulse, steadying your mind. Anxiety may knock, but peace answers the door. Stress may rise, but calm speaks louder. You step into the world not as one bracing for storms, but as one sheltered by God's presence. Morning prayer becomes your anchor, holding you firm when chaos tries to sweep you away, reminding you you don't walk today's road alone. You feel your heart soften as you realize morning prayer doesn't end with you. It spills outward. The love God pours into your spirit becomes love you carry into every conversation. The early Christians were known for greeting one another with warmth that astonished their neighbors and historians still argue whether this came from cultural hospitality or from genuine transformation by prayer. Either way, their mornings of devotion overflowed into visible kindness. And here's a curious tidbit. In some villages, people once sprinkled the first water drawn at dawn around their doorways, believing it carried blessing for anyone who entered. Quirky, yes, but it reflects the same hope you carry, that those who cross your path might meet peace. So as you leave your room and step into the day, your smile can become a benediction. Your gentle words may feel small, yet they ripple like sunlight spilling through windows. The patience you choose in traffic, the kindness you offer at work, the compassion you extend to someone weary. All of it flows from this quiet time you've shared with God. Prayer begins in the stillness, but love shows itself in the world, shaping how others experience His presence through you. You remember that sunrise we talked about earlier, how its light slowly stretched across the sky? In the same way, your life becomes a testimony, not all at once, but through small, steady steps. Early Christians were sometimes called people of the way, and historians still argue whether that term meant a secret code or simply a reminder of daily choices. Either way, faith was lived in the ordinary, in the quiet witness of how they walked. And here's a quirky fact. In some old European towns, people believed the way you stepped out of your door in the morning determined your luck. Right foot first meant blessings. Left foot first meant trouble. Of course, superstition can't rule your day, but it does remind you every step matters. So as you move through today, think of your choices as brushstrokes, painting God's light across the canvas of your life. A kind reply, a forgiving word, a humble action. These are not small. They are testimony. You may never know who notices, who is encouraged, or who is drawn closer to God because of how you walked. But heaven sees and heaven smiles when your morning prayers turn into living proof of His love. You let your spirit settle now, every thought of the morning gathered into one prayer of surrender. You lift your heart as countless dawn seekers have lifted theirs, saying, Lord, this day is yours. The early church often closed morning prayers with blessing, and historians still argue whether those words were formulaic or spontaneous, but their intent was always the same, to hand the day into God's care. And here's a curious detail. Some families in the 19th century kept a morning jar where they placed written prayers at sunrise, believing each slip of paper carried blessing into the hours ahead. Perhaps quaint, but it reminds you of something timeless. Your words matter, and God receives them tenderly. So now, in the glow of morning light, you surrender your plans, your worries, your hopes. You trust the God who never slumbers, who walks beside you through every shadow and every joy. You whisper, guide me, protect me, and let me be a vessel of your peace. And with that, you breathe deep, steady, and sure, stepping into the day not alone but hand in hand with grace. And now, as the morning softens and your heart feels at rest, let your spirit linger in this stillness a little longer. Picture the sunlight stretching gently across your path, each ray a reminder that God's love goes before you. Carry this peace into your work, your conversations, your pauses, knowing that the same presence that filled this moment will guard every step ahead. Whatever unfolds today, you are never beyond His gaze, never outside His care. So walk slowly, breathe deeply, and trust that the God who began this morning with you will finish it in blessing.